morning we'll be talking about Symphony Console. So Bin Magento is based on Symphony Console. It's was integrated so that you can use Symphony Console as your basically an N98 that's already built into Magento. So we're going to talk about some of the really easy steps first. First, I'm sure everybody knows you can run just bin Magento as a command. You'll get a full list of all of the commands that are integrated. This is really nice to use when you're testing new commands. This way you know that your command's already being pulled in through the XML and when you're loading things, so that way you'll know if you need to regenerate anything or flush cache or anything like that. Every command already has a help option integrated already into it, so you can do --help or -h. This gives you the help messages that you already built into your config method, so that you're able to tell your user what they're supposed to do with this command, and they're not just blindly running a one-word command that they almost know what it does. Symphony Console also is rather intuitive on how it interprets the commands that you're giving it. So you don't actually have to type out the whole word whenever you're giving it a command. So in reality, all three of these are actually valid commands that Symphony Console and Bin Magento understand. The first one being cache flush, which I'm sure everybody uses quite often. The second one is admin user create. And the third is maintenance enable. You can do this with any of the commands. It is able to interpret it as long as it's the only one that matches those initials. They don't excuse me, they don't have to be just the initials. So you can do main:"en for maintenance enable. That also will work. You don't actually have to type it out every time. This is good to know when you are naming your commands, so that you can actually employ this whenever you do this and you're not creating a command that's, maintenance flag, and it overrides on maintenance, and then you have to type out the whole word maintenance every time you want to use it. So I'm not going to talk about how to create a module. Most everybody knows how to do this. Magento 2's been out for a while, and if I spend time talking about this, I'm going to take up most of my time up here. So I'm going to cut right to the chase. In order to integrate a command, you're going to go right to your DI XML, add a command through the command list node within the XML. Rather straightforward, rather simple, shouldn't take that much. Next, you're going to create your command object. This is basically your controller for command line. You should treat it like it's a controller. You shouldn't be doing most of your work here. You should be using services. You should be injecting what you're going to use in the constructor. Symphony Console already in the constructor pulls in the name of the command. You don't have to set it here. You can choose to if you would like. It's up to you. You're also able to set it in the config method, which I'm sure most people do as well. You shouldn't do any of your other initialization in the constructor. Now, this sounds a little bit weird with most objects, but the way Symphony Console builds the application, it builds the command object first and then adds it to the application. So if you're trying to do anything on the application level or get the application that it's using to get any of its methods or its functions, it's not going to know about the application yet. It hasn't been integrated to that application, so it doesn't know any of that information yet. So you really should only be declaring your injectables as fields so that you're able to use it in the rest of the command. Next, we're going to talk about the life cycle of the command. There are 4 methods in the life cycle of a Symphony Console command. Most people are used to only using the config and the execute method. Initialize doesn't have as many uses as interact does. Interact is a lot more useful and actually happens before some of the validation within Symphony Console. So we're going to talk about each method individually. Within the config method, you're going to set your basic stuff. You're going to set your name, you're going to set your description, and you're going to set the help. You should always make sure you set a good description and a good help. The help ends up being displayed on the detail page, so you can be as lengthy as you want. Make sure you tell your users how to use your command, possibly give them examples if there's many ways to use it, depending on how many options and arguments that you have. So what does this look like whenever we add our command, and this is what our configuration looks like? Well, when we run bin Magento, like I said, it will list all our commands. So on the top, that's what your command will end up coming in as. Your description shows on that main help page so that your user is able to know exactly what they're looking at and what it's going to do. The set help is what's displayed at the bottom of your, whenever you call the detailed help, which is the -h, or I'm sorry, the -help or the -h. This will display every option and every argument that's already built into your command, as well as your help message. So like I said, you want to put a lot of detail here, give them examples, show them what they need to do with it, so they know how to use your command. Next step in your configuration method, you want to add your arguments and add your options. Now, there's two differences between arguments and options. One being arguments, you're not going to declare what the argument is when you tell it. You're just telling it this is the value that it's going to be entered, where options are the -- or the - options that end up after it. So what happens when we add what those commands where you end up with your argument list in your detailed help with the descriptions, as well as your options will show in with the rest of the options. You can set the descriptions. Again, make sure you have verbose descriptions. Tell your users what they do. It's very aggravating when you go to try to use something and you can't figure out how it works because there's no help. So the anatomy of an argument. Basically, like I said, arguments are the ones that don't get declared by the -- options. So you have to at least have, I don't want to say a short number of arguments, but you don't want to have too many because it can start to be confusing on what order they're in. But there are two types of arguments, required and optional. Required obviously has to be there. If you don't give it, it will throw an error when it gets to the execute method. There are ways to get around that, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But with optionals, you can choose to leave them out, and when they're left out, it will end up displaying, it will give you the value of null when you try to call that argument. Sometimes you don't need the arguments. They can be optional, so you can choose to not have that as required. You're also able to set them as is array, which means you can set multiple ones. With arguments, you have to set, it has to be the last one of the arguments in the list that gets set as is array. The way it works is you can actually give it multiple values in a row, and when you call the get argument, it will return an array of each of the arguments that were passed to it. Same works with the optional version, whereas if you don't put any of them, it doesn't actually complain. Like I said, only the last argument in the list can actually be set as the is array. It doesn't make much sense for the other ones because it won't know where to cut off between the two. So the anatomy of an option, they're mostly the same. There's a few differences. This time there's 3 of them, required and optional. Required works a little bit differently on a option versus an argument. On an option, on an option, if the value is required, it doesn't mean the option is required. It means that you have to declare a value to the option, meaning adding an equals and then the value, or you can skip the equals and it can pick up on that that's the value. The third option being none works just like the help option does. So you don't have to pass it a value. It's not going to expect a value. And whenever you call that that option's value in the execute method, you'll get a Boolean value of whether it exists or don't exist whenever it was called. Like I said, both required and optional can be set as arrays. Maybe they can be set as arrays. Okay. There we go. With these, though, when you set them as an array, any of them can be set as an array. Multiple of them can be set as an array. The way they get called as an array, you have to declare the option multiple times. So let's say we have an option that is capitalized because it's going to capitalize whatever the output is. And there's multiple different words in this. So you want to say that, OK, 3 different words are going to be capitalized. You can do -- capitalize the first word, -- capitalize the second word, -- capitalize the third word, all in your command. And when you call that option, you'll get an array of each of those values. Next up in our life cycle of a command is the initialize method. This acts as kind of your constructor. Like I said, you shouldn't be doing any kind of actual construction of your object within the constructor because of the life cycle of the way the console command gets created. So this is the first stop after the configuration method. So once you configure it, this is where you'll set everything else up that you need for the rest of the lifecycle of the command. Sometimes this is getting values out of system config or things like that. The other thing, arguments and options have not been validated yet. What this means is if you've declared it as required or the value as required, Symfony is going to validate that during the lifecycle and give you errors stating that something that was required was not passed. So this stuff all happens before that validation occurs, so you still have the option of being able to set those values before you end up getting that error. Next up is the interact method. This one's got a lot more to it. Initialize is kind of short. There's not a whole lot that goes on there. But in interact, you're able to ask your user for input. So if they don't put something in, or they forgot to add an argument or an option, or you just want it to be an interactive console app so that they don't have to sit there and remember all of those arguments and options that they're going to put in, you're able to just prompt them for questions. There's a lot of different ways to get the questions and ask the questions. With this method, all commands have a no interaction option on them. What that does is allow the command to completely skip this method. So if you want it to not be interactive, say you're going to use your command in some kind of deployment script or migration script or something like that, and you don't want it to be interactive, you want it to just throw an error if something is missing, you can give it the no interaction option and it completely skips this method. You want to use questions here to ask for input. Realize that sounds weird when we talk about it in English, but there's actually a question object in Symfony Console that helps expedite a lot of this, so you're not sitting there trying to do a lot of the output through the output object itself. You should also validate your arguments and options in this method. What this means is if you, let's say, are asking for a customer ID or a product ID so that you can act on that model, you want to first check that that one actually exists in your database. So you should validate that here. So if it's missing, you still have the option of prompting your user for a different one and letting them know it's wrong. Or if you choose, you can have it error out as well. Also, you still have not been validated by Symfony Console. Sounds a little weird because I just said to validate all your objects, but yet Symfony hasn't validated yet. All that validation is just whether it's required or not. So it's not going to throw the errors until between this step and the execute step. So once you get to the execute method and you are missing an argument, it will fail before you get to the execute method. You will not actually execute anything. So if you are going to prompt your user or do anything with your input before that validation happens, it must be done in either the initialize or the interact methods. There we go. So like I said, to ask a question, there are many different ways. I realize this is a very large block of code. I'm not going to sit here and explain the whole thing to you. It was meant to illustrate that setting up a question can become a lengthy process. There are helpers and helper objects built into Symfony Console that help move this along a lot quicker than what this looks like. Wanted to break it down, though, so that everybody can understand the different pieces that go into a question. So to break it down, you have a set normalizer. You can pass in a function to this. The normalizer normalizes the input that your user is given. All this really is like if you're setting, trim to cut off the white space, or say you want to make sure that it's all capital letters or all lowercase letters, you're able to normalize that input from this method. Normalizers get a little bit weird. If you're going to do something lengthy in a normalizer, then you may want to use one. If you are only going to trim the white space, you may only want to do that in your validator before you do the validation, just to help skip an extra step in this process, because it does get quite lengthy. And the normalizer is not set in the constructor where the validator is. You can also set your question to be hidden. This will work like a password then, so your user's input won't actually be displayed in the console, but will still actually be passed into the application. So it's used for passwords, stuff like that, so it doesn't end up in your console history anywhere. It's a little bit nice to use. There is a parameter for it. I don't understand why you would ever set it to false, because it's defaulted to false, but you do have to set it to true. You can't just leave it blank. Because there are different tricks and ways that Symfony Console does to actually hide that output, if it can't actually deploy any of those tricks, it will default back to just showing the input so that it's not failing in a weird state that you have something environment wrong with what you're doing. There is also a fallback, so you can set the hidden fallback. If you don't want it to fall back to being displayed and you want it to either error out or something like that, you can set the fallback to bypass how it falls back as well. You can also set max attempts. This slide is going to end up running off of the thing, so I'm going to have to go from memory a little bit here. But max attempts, basically you can set it so if a user is giving you either giving wrong input or, like I said, if you're validating a customer ID and they're fishing for one that actually exists, you can reprompt on anything that didn't validate. So if it doesn't validate, you can set your max attempts. If you set the max attempts to null, it's infinite. It'll continue to ask until the user gets it right or hits Control-C to get out of it. Like I said, this is running off, so I apologize. I didn't realize that it was going to end up being this long. You are also, if I remember correctly, you are also able to set the display of the question here. So if you wanted to set the output, say, color it in a different way so that your user knows that it's actually something they're supposed to be inputting and not just another line that's in your output. That's good. There we go. Lastly, we hit the execute method. This is one everybody's used to using because this is where all of the actual work gets done. Like I said, you should be treating your command like it's a controller. You shouldn't do many of the heavy lifting here. You should be bringing in different services and different repositories to be able to facilitate most of that work. It works just like the APIs, so you end up with different, the same methodology that ends up in your controller versus your API. You'll end up with that here too, so if you're trying to do anything from command line that is similar to any of the controllers or anything in admin panel, you'll end up with the same use case, basically. So using your services makes this a lot simpler and gets the work out of this. So like I said, it should be treated like a controller. Like I said, also arguments by this point and options, they've been validated. So if they're missing and they're supposed to be required, it will have already thrown an error and you would never have made it to this method. So a lot of people end up getting confused when they start asking questions and stuff like that in the execute method, and then they get confused as to, well, it's prompting for the answer. Why am I not getting the prompt? Why am I not hitting this? It's just telling me it's required and not present. You can't ask questions in the execute method. It's not, because of that validation, it's not going to be useful to do that. The execute method also, it's where all of your output comes out. So you really shouldn't be doing any of the logging or anything like that in the other methods unless you kind of need some logging in the initialize method. But like I said, that ends up being a lot shorter in most cases. There we go. So next off, we're going to start talking about styling the output. There are many ways, again, to style the output in Symfony Console. So most basic way, you can use tags. These are the 4 built-in tags into Symfony Console. So on the left is how to actually declare them. It mostly looks like HTML, except the closing tags don't actually have to have a tag name. You can just do the slash. On the right side of this is what each of those would look like in the correct order. So that's what your info, your comment, your question, and your error, that's what they're pre-built as, and how Symfony has the default set. So output has a right and a right line. Really the only difference between the two, if you do right line, it adds a new line at the end of your output, whereas right won't add that new line. Like I said, you can use tags to style your output. There's a output formatter as well. So if you want to set your own tags, make up your own styles, you're able to set the tag and then use the tags within it instead of having to declare the colors and the options every time. So with styling the output, within Symfony Console, there's a Symfony style object. You're able to use this object to help facilitate building titles, sections, messaging. Progress bar is actually built into this, so you can build a progress bar that will actually step through. You can set a max number of what the total is on it, and from there, you can step through it. So let's say you're downloading assets for the website. You know that there are 5,000 pictures that have to be downloaded into the site on a migration. You can set the max number to 5,000 and then progress through it, step by each picture, or step every 10 pictures, or how often you want to do that, so that your user can actually see that your command's still working and you didn't just freeze and they're staring at a dead console. Also helps facilitate some of the questioning, so that way you're not just asking straight questions to get straight answers. You can do a confirm question, which is a simple yes or no. It's smart enough to know the difference between yes and no, YN, capital Y versus lowercase y, that kind of stuff. And it will always return the Boolean value instead of giving you what the input was, so that you don't have to try to validate that. So within Symfony Console, they've already styled this stuff for us as a template style. So this is what the styles look like as defaults in Symfony Console. Not really sure why the messaging, almost every single one of them is red. That seems a little odd to me, since there's a lot more colors than just red and green. At least they didn't make the success one red. That would have been a little awkward. So what I ended up doing on Monday was creating a pull request to build a Magento style. I didn't like the way Symfony had built the styles and wanted to build a more user-friendly and intuitive way of having those styles present and ways to show your user how to, or not, I'm sorry, not how to, but what it's actually doing and what the output is. So basically I created another object using the same interface as the style interface to start changing some of these. So what I've proposed is adding some yellow messages for the warnings and the caution, because warnings are only warnings, they're not errors. Red should be for errors, things that are showstoppers, things that basically you're going to end your execution, where warnings are just letting them know that something didn't go right. Also, I changed the progress bar. In Symfony style, they have it set up so that on Mac OS, it'll show with the fuzzy icons like it was on the previous slide, and on Windows, it shows with the equals and the caret like I show it here. I removed the switch and just gave it the equals and the arrow for both operating systems. I didn't really understand why they wanted to show different operating systems different ways. But with them being equal signs, both have an equal sign, so it shouldn't be a big deal. I didn't really do much with the table. There's a lot more that goes into styling a table, and I only had a couple hours to get something done, so I didn't want to spend time on trying to reformat the table. So in conclusion here, the first point, you want to never let your user fail. Like I said, you always want to ask your questions. You always want to make sure that there's not just going to be an error out at the execute method. Always make sure your user gets prompted for the missing stuff. So it's a bad experience when you try to go and run a command and then it fails. Well, this is required and this is required. Now you got to run the help, figure out all your options, and rewrite it turns into a longer process instead of just writing a command. If you miss it, just fill in the inputs and move on. Next, don't ask questions in the execute method. Like I said, it validates before the execute method. You don't want to ask your questions before this. It doesn't make sense and it won't really work. Lastly, you want to use short, concise, one-word command names. Like I said at the beginning, it's intuitive enough to be able to just work with the initials of your commands. So you're able to just call it by partial names. So you want to make sure that your command names aren't going to overlap other command names. Let's say that. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, anything?
You mentioned that you should put all of your validation in the interact method.
Yes.
But the interact method can be skipped through the non-interactive version of the command line. Is there not an approach where you can validate both for interactive and non-interactive calls?
It would depend on why you want to validate beforehand. Like I said, if you're doing it from like your command line scripts or a deployment script, you're going to want it to fail anyway, even if the validation doesn't pass. So that way you know there's something wrong with it. I mean, it's a built-in script and it's pre-written, so you're not having the human element effect there. If you really want to validate it and make sure that it can run in non-interactive mode, you can validate in the initialize method if you want.
Yep.
So that is an option. I'm not sure where the use case would be to need to validate on no interaction.
More detailed error messaging would be the only thing I could think of offhand if you wanted to make sure that you had certain information that maybe an exception wouldn't give you as far as what happened and why it didn't work.
Okay. With your erroring, I mean, you should be giving them the best error you can give them and letting them know exactly what's wrong. So you shouldn't be holding any of that back when it does error.
Okay, true. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Do you have any tips on testing commands, writing unit tests and things like that?
Within Symphony Console, there is a command tester and a test command. One is the test command is meant to be a command that will run just as test, so that you can test different input options and stuff like that. The command tester is able to run those commands for you and actually get the output as a string instead of interacting with your console. I kind of left testing out of this because I didn't want it to turn into too long of a talk. When I did this before with the testing, it ended up going to about 45 minutes. So I mean, there are a lot more options with testing. I apologize for leaving it out. Not really sure how to explain it in a nutshell for you.
No, that's cool.
Any more questions?
Cool. No questions? Well, thanks.
Okay.
You don't have your Twitter handle or anything up on a slide.
Yeah, I failed at introducing myself on my slides.
Yeah, it's fine. Wesley's from a rubber firm, and I just tweeted him and his Twitter handle using the MM17 NYC hashtag. So if you want to talk about testing, grab him outside or hit him on a tweet and figure it out from there. Cool?
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.